your incantations right now!
Chaos. Absolute chaos at 35,000 feet. Oxygen masks dangling from the ceiling like broken promises. Passengers screaming, their voices blending into a symphony of terror that no human being should ever have to hear. The plane shaking so violently that carry-on bags were tumbling from overhead compartments like deadly rain, crashing into seats, into the aisle, into the heads and shoulders of people who were already convinced they were about to die. The emergency lighting had kicked on, bathing everything in that sickly yellow glow that makes everyone look like corpses. The air was thick with the smell of fear, sweat mingling with the acrid scent of something burning, something that shouldn't be burning, something that meant this was real, this was happening, this wasn't just turbulence or a bad dream you could wake up from. People were crying. Grown men were sobbing into their hands. A woman in row 15 was hyperventilating so badly that her husband was trying to get her to breathe into a paper bag while his own hands shook like leaves in a hurricane. A businessman in first class was frantically typing on his phone, trying to send a final message to his family, his face wet with tears he probably hadn't cried since he was a child. And in the middle of all this pandemonium, in the middle of this nightmare unfolding at hundreds of miles per hour, in seat 22E near the back of the plane, sat 8-year-old Mary Johnson. Her eyes were squeezed shut so tightly that her whole face had scrunched up. Her small hands were clasped together in front of her chest, fingers interlaced, gripping each other so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, so tightly that you could see the strain in her small arms, in her shoulders, in every muscle of her tiny body. Her lips were moving rapidly, constantly, whispering words that no one else could hear over the screaming and the alarms and the terrible groaning of metal under stress and the desperate prayers of 212 passengers who had suddenly violently realized that they might not make it home tonight. That this might be it. That this might be how their story ends. Mary's cornrows with their colorful beads were shaking with the vibration of the plane, clicking together in a rhythm that should have been cheerful but instead sounded like a countdown, like a timer ticking down to something terrible. Her purple backpack with all those handmade airplane pins had fallen to the floor, spilling some of its contents into the aisle. Her grandfather's worn leather Bible had slipped from her lap and was wedged against the seat in front of her. But Mary didn't notice any of that. She was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere deep in prayer. Somewhere beyond fear. Somewhere that 8-year-old children shouldn't have to go but sometimes do when the world asks too much of them. And her grandmother, Ruth, was holding her. Arms wrapped around this little girl, her own face pressed against Mary's head, her own lips moving in prayer, her own tears falling onto her granddaughter's hair, mingling with the beads that she had so carefully braided in just that morning, back when the world made sense, back when they were just going to Atlanta to see Mary's mother, back before everything went wrong. But here's where the story gets interesting. Here's where everything you think you know about faith and prejudice and miracles and human nature gets turned completely upside down and shaken until you don't know which way is up anymore. Because the voice cutting through all that chaos, the voice rising above the terror and the panic and the screaming and the alarms, the voice that should have been offering comfort or reassurance or hope or at least some semblance of professional calm, that voice wasn't trying to help anyone. That voice belonged to Flight Attendant Janet Whitmore, and she was yelling 4 words that would haunt her for the rest of her life, for words that would replay in her nightmares and her quiet moments and every time she looked in a mirror and had to face who she had become. Someone stop that child. Not, prepare for emergency landing. Not, stay calm, we've got this. Not, everything's going to be okay. Not, the pilots are doing everything they can. Not any of the things that a flight attendant is trained to say, that a person with even a shred of compassion would think to say in a moment like this. No. She was telling someone, anyone, to stop an 8-year-old girl from praying. Let that sink in for a moment. Let that really penetrate. While an airplane was literally falling apart around them, while metal was groaning and systems were failing and grown men were making peace with their gods, while mothers were clutching their children and businessmen were frantically texting final messages to their families and people were saying goodbye to life itself, a flight attendant was demanding that someone silence a little black girl's prayer. Not because she was screaming. Not because she was panicking. Not because she was running through the aisles or doing anything that could actually interfere with emergency procedures. But because she was praying. And Janet Whitmore, in her infinite wisdom and her carefully controlled rage and her desperate need to maintain some semblance of control in a situation that was spiraling wildly beyond anyone's control, had decided that this was unacceptable. That this, of all things, was the problem that needed to be addressed right now. She's making this worse. Janet screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria barely held in check, her perfect composure finally shattering under the weight of fear and something else, something darker, something that had been building for months. Someone get her to stop. She's scaring the other passengers. As if the other passengers weren't already terrified. As if the oxygen masks and the emergency lighting and the smell of smoke and the violent shaking weren't enough. As if an 8-year-old girl whispering prayers was somehow more frightening than the very real possibility that they were all about to die. But what you don't know yet, what nobody on that plane knew in that moment of absolute chaos and terror, what Janet Whitmore couldn't have known because she had refused to listen, refused to see, refused to consider that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have all the answers, was that Mary Johnson's prayer wasn't just some desperate plea to a distant God who may or may not be listening. It wasn't the terrified babbling of a scared child trying to comfort herself while the world fell apart around her. It wasn't superstition or wishful thinking or the kind of religious performance that makes non-believers uncomfortable. No, Mary's prayer had started 6 hours earlier. 6 hours before the engine caught fire. 6 hours before the alarm started screaming. 6 hours before the emergency systems kicked in. 6 hours before Janet Whitmore's carefully constructed world of rules and procedures and the illusion of control came crashing down around her prejudice and her pride and her bitter, wounded ego. Because Mary Johnson had seen this. All of it. The fire engulfing the left engine. The panic spreading through the cabin like a virus. The oxygen masks dropping. The plane shaking. The near-death experience that was about to become international news, that was about to be plastered across every screen and newspaper and social media feed in the world. She had seen it, clear as day, vivid as life, real as the seat beneath her. And she had tried to warn them. Had tried to tell them that something was wrong, that God had shown her something, that they needed to listen. And they had punished her for it. Mocked her. Dismissed her. Moved her to the back of the plane like she was some kind of problem that needed to be hidden away. So let's go back. Let's rewind to where this really started, to the beginning of this incredible, terrible, miraculous story. To a quiet morning at Newark International Airport, where a little girl with cornrows decorated with colorful beads was about to board a flight that would change everything. That would challenge everything people thought they knew about faith and science, about prejudice and redemption, about who deserves to be heard and who deserves to be believed. It's 6:15 in the morning at Newark International Airport, and the terminal is already buzzing with the familiar chaos of early travelers. The kind of controlled pandemonium that happens every single day in airports across the world, so routine that nobody even notices it anymore. Business people rushing past with their roller bags clicking rhythmically against the tile floor and their coffee cups clutched like lifelines and their phones pressed to their ears because God forbid they disconnect from work for even the few hours it takes to fly across the country. Families juggling strollers and car seats and diaper bags and the impossible task of keeping toddlers entertained while waiting for boarding, while navigating security, while doing all the 1,000 little things that make traveling with small children feel like a military operation. College students slumped in chairs with their backpacks and their headphones and their complete exhaustion from finals or partying or both. Elderly couples moving slowly, carefully, holding each other's arms for support and stopping frequently to rest and check their gate numbers for the third or fourth time because airports are confusing and overwhelming when your joints ache and your vision isn't what it used to be. The smell of Cinnabon mixing with Starbucks coffee and airplane fuel and that weird recycled air quality that all airports have, that strange scent that's not quite fresh but not quite stale, just different, just other, just airport. The sound of gate agents making announcements that nobody listens to until they hear their own flight number. The beeping of golf carts carrying passengers who need assistance. The crying of babies who don't understand why their ears hurt or why they can't run around or why everything is taking so long. The shuffle of thousands of feet. The murmur of thousands of conversations, the buzz of thousands of lives intersecting briefly in this transitional space before scattering again to destinations all across the country, all across the world. And there, sitting quietly in gate 37, somehow still in the middle of all this chaos, is Mary Johnson. She's 8 years old, though if you looked at her, if you really looked, you might think she was older. Not physically. She's small for her age, actually skinny in the way that kids are before puberty hits, all long limbs and knobby knees and the kind of thinness that makes grandmothers want to feed you. But there's something in her eyes that seems older. A gravity. A seriousness. The kind of look that makes you realize this child has already learned lessons that most adults spend their whole lives avoiding. She carries herself with a kind of calm that you don't usually see in children, especially not in airports, especially not in the early morning when most kids are cranky and tired and whining about wanting to go home or wanting snacks or wanting literally anything except to be sitting in an uncomfortable chair waiting for a plane. Her hair is done up in neat cornrows, the kind that take hours to do properly, the kind that require patience and skill and steady hands. Each cornrow is finished with a small colorful bead, red and yellow and blue and green, bright primary colors that catch the light when she moves her head. They click softly against each other, a gentle percussion that somehow manages to be audible even in the airport noise, a soft musical sound that draws the eye, that makes people glance over and smile at this little girl with her beautiful hair and her quiet dignity. She's wearing a purple backpack that's almost as big as she is, the straps adjusted as tight as they'll go but still hanging low on her small frame. It's clearly well used, the fabric slightly faded, the zipper's a little sticky, the kind of backpack that's been on a lot of adventures, that's been to school and church and sleepovers and everywhere else an 8-year-old goes. But if you look closely, if you really examine it, you'll notice something unusual about this backpack. It's covered in little pins. Not the kind you buy at gift shops or collect from different cities. These are handmade. Each one is carefully crafted from wire and beads, twisted into the shape of tiny airplanes, each one unique, each one slightly different in color and size and design. There must be 20 of them, maybe more, covering the front and sides of the backpack like a flock of birds frozen in flight. And if you asked Mary about them, if you took the time to kneel down to her level and show genuine interest instead of that condescending adult voice people use with children, she would tell you that each one represents a prayer. A prayer for safe travels. A prayer for protection. A prayer for everyone who flies, everyone who trusts their life to physics and engineering and the skill of pilots they've never met. She would tell you that she makes one before every trip, no matter how short. That she's been making them since she was 5 years old, since her grandfather taught her how to twist the wire and thread the beads and form the shape of something that can fly, something that can defy gravity, something that represents both human achievement and divine protection. She would tell you all of this in her quiet, serious voice, with those eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than 8 years should allow, and you would believe her. You would understand somehow that for this little girl, these pins aren't just craft projects or decorations. They're acts of faith. They're tangible representations of invisible prayers. They're proof that she believes, really believes, that words whispered to God matter, that they go somewhere, that they do something. But nobody's asking Mary about her pins right now. Right now, she's just another passenger waiting in gate 37, sitting in one of those uncomfortable airport chairs that seem specifically designed to make you appreciate airplane seats by comparison, her feet dangling several inches above the floor because she's not tall enough for them to reach. She's clutching a Bible. And this isn't a children's Bible with cartoon pictures of Noah's Ark and Daniel in the lion's den and all the sanitized, simplified stories that we tell kids to make religion feel safe and comfortable and non-threatening. This isn't one of those Bibles with Jesus depicted as a handsome white man with flowing brown hair and kind eyes, the kind that bears absolutely no resemblance to a first-century Jewish carpenter from Nazareth. No, this is a real Bible. Adult-sized. Leather-bound, though the leather is worn now, cracked at the corners, soft and supple from years of handling. The kind of Bible that's been read so many times that certain pages fall open on their own, that the binding automatically opens to Psalms or John or Romans or whichever passages have been visited most frequently. The kind of Bible that has notes in the margins, verses underlined, passages highlighted, a history of engagement written in the wear patterns and the pencil marks and the dog-eared pages. The kind of Bible that's been held during prayers that mattered. During moments of crisis and joy and grief and gratitude. During times when words were all you had left. When faith was the only thing standing between you and complete despair. This Bible belonged to Mary's grandfather, Thomas Johnson. And if Bibles could talk, if they could tell the stories of everyone who'd held them, everyone who'd cried over their pages, everyone who'd searched their words for comfort or guidance or just some sense that there was meaning in the chaos, this one would have quite a tale to tell. It would tell you about a man who grew up in Mississippi in the 1940s, when being a black man in the South meant navigating a world designed to break you, to convince you that you were less than human, to keep you in your place through violence and fear and systematic oppression. It would tell you about a young Thomas Johnson who believed anyway, who held on to faith not because it made life easier, because it didn't, but because without it, without something bigger to believe in, the weight of reality would have crushed him completely. It would tell you about prayers whispered in the dark when crosses burned in yards and churches exploded and children were murdered for the crime of wanting to go to school. About prayers shouted in joy when grandbabies were born and weddings were celebrated and small victories were won against impossible odds. About prayers sobbed in grief when friends died too young and injustice went unpunished and the world seemed too broken to fix. This Bible has been held through all of that. Through births and deaths, marriages and divorces, triumphs and tragedies. It's been to more churches than most people visit in a lifetime. It's been on more journeys than most travelers complete. And every single page carries the fingerprints, literal and metaphorical, of a man who believed that God was real and present and active in the world, even when the world gave him every reason to doubt. Sitting next to Mary is her grandmother, Ruth Johnson. She's 67 years old, though she carries those years with a grace that makes age seem irrelevant. Her hair has gone salt and pepper, natural and beautiful, cut short in a style that's both practical and elegant. Her face carries the deep lines that come from a life fully lived, from laughter and tears and everything in between, from decades of experiencing the full range of human emotion and somehow coming through it with her dignity intact. She's wearing her Sunday best even though it's Thursday morning. A navy blue dress that she's had for probably 15 years, that she's worn to weddings and funerals and graduations and every other important occasion that required something nicer than everyday clothes. Sensible shoes that are comfortable enough to walk through an airport but nice enough to show respect. A simple gold cross necklace, small and understated, that was a gift from her husband before he passed. She's the kind of woman who still believes that how you present yourself matters, that there's dignity in dressing well, that showing respect for yourself and others is important even in a world that increasingly treats everything as casual and disposable. Ruth is elegant in the way that black women of her generation often are, carrying herself with a pride and poise that life has tried repeatedly to strip away but never quite succeeded. She's been knocked down more times than she can count. Life has thrown things at her that would have broken weaker people. Poverty and racism and loss and disappointment and all the thousand small and large cruelties that accumulate over a lifetime. But she's still here. Still standing. Still finding ways to maintain her dignity and her faith and her belief that tomorrow might be better than today, even when today gives her precious little reason to hope. And you can see it in her eyes right now, the worry etched so deep it seems permanent. The fear. The kind of bone-deep terror that comes from knowing you might lose the most important person in your world and being absolutely powerless to prevent it. They're flying to Atlanta. But this isn't a vacation. This isn't a fun trip to visit relatives or see the sights or escape the New Jersey winter for a few days of southern sunshine. This isn't one of those journeys you look forward to, that you mark on your calendar with excitement, that you count down the days until. No, this is the kind of trip you dread. The kind that sits in your stomach like a stone. The kind that makes every moment leading up to it feel surreal, like you're watching yourself go through the motions from outside your body, like this can't really be happening except it is. It absolutely is. Mary's mother, Sarah Johnson, is lying in a hospital bed in Atlanta right now. Right this very moment, while her daughter sits in a Newark airport clutching her grandfather's Bible, Sarah is being prepped for surgery. Nurses are checking her vitals. Doctors are reviewing her charts. Anesthesiologists are calculating dosages. The surgical team is going over procedures and discussing contingencies and doing all the things they do before they open up someone's skull and try to remove the thing that's trying to kill them. Sarah is 32 years old. 32. An age when most people are just hitting their stride, when life is supposed to be opening up, when you're supposed to be raising your kids and building your career and planning for the future and worrying about normal things like mortgages and school districts and retirement savings. Not brain tumors. Not mortality. Not whether you're going to live to see your daughter's 9th birthday. 3 weeks ago Sarah was fine. Or at least she seemed fine. She woke up in her apartment in Atlanta, the same apartment where she'd lived since Mary's father left when Mary was 2, the same apartment where she'd raised her daughter alone, working 2 jobs, scraping by, doing everything she could to give Mary a stable life even when stability seemed impossible. She made breakfast. Just a normal Thursday morning. Pancakes because Mary loved pancakes, and even though Mary was in New Jersey staying with her grandmother for a few weeks while Sarah worked double shifts to save up for Christmas presents, Sarah still made pancakes out of habit, out of muscle memory, out of the comfort of routine. She was standing at the stove, flipping pancakes, humming along to the radio. Some songs she didn't even really like, just whatever was playing, just background noise to fill the empty apartment. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window. The coffee was brewing. Everything was normal. And then the world tilted. That's the only way Sarah could describe it later. The world just tilted like someone had grabbed reality and yanked it sideways. The floor seemed to rush up at her. The ceiling seemed to spiral. Colors got too bright and then too dark. Sound got muffled and then too loud. And then nothing. Sarah woke up on her kitchen floor with paramedics standing over her and a neighbor who'd heard the crash kneeling beside her and pancakes burning on the stove and absolutely no memory of falling, no memory of the moments between standing and lying down. Just nothing, just a blank space where time should have been. The neighbor, Mrs. Chen from across the hall, had heard the thud and the crash of Sarah's body hitting the floor and then the counter and then the floor again. Had heard the smoke alarm going off from the burning pancakes. Had used her emergency key to let herself in and found Sarah unconscious, unresponsive, lying in a position that made Mrs. Chen think immediately of her own mother, who'd had a stroke 10 years ago and died 3 days later. The ambulance came. The EMTs did their assessments. Sarah regained consciousness in the ambulance, confused and terrified and asking about her daughter, about Mary. Was Mary okay? Someone needed to check on Mary, except Mary wasn't there. Mary was safe in New Jersey with Ruth, but Sarah's brain wasn't processing that information correctly, wasn't processing much of anything correctly. The hospital ran tests. CT scans and MRIs and blood work and neurological exams and all the expensive, invasive procedures that modern medicine uses to peer inside the human body and try to figure out what's wrong. And they found it. A tumor. Glioblastoma. One of the most aggressive forms of brain cancer. Fast-growing. Deadly. The kind that doesn't give you years to prepare. The kind that measures your remaining time in months if you're lucky, weeks if you're not. It was about the size of a golf ball, nestled in Sarah's frontal lobe, pressing against tissue that controlled motor function and speech and all the things that make us us. Already causing damage. Already stealing pieces of who Sarah was. The doctors gave her options, which is what doctors always say when they really mean, this is bad, this is really bad, and we can try things but honestly we don't know if any of them will work. Surgery. Radiation. Chemotherapy. Clinical trials. Aggressive treatment that might kill the tumor or might just make her final months miserable. Conservative treatment that would definitely be easier but would also definitely result in her death, probably within 6 months. Sarah chose surgery. Not because the odds were good, because they weren't. The doctors gave her a 60% chance of survival. 60%. Which sounds almost optimistic until you really think about it, until you translate it into the reality that there's a 4 in 10 chance that when they open up her skull tomorrow morning, something will go wrong. The tumor will be too integrated with healthy tissue. There will be complications. The cancer will have spread in ways the scans didn't show. Her body will have a bad reaction to anesthesia. Her brain will swell. 1,000 different things could go wrong and 4 times out of 10 they do. But 60% was better than 0%, which is what she'd have if she did nothing. So Sarah signed the consent forms and made the phone calls and tried to figure out how to tell her 8-year-old daughter that mommy might not wake up from this surgery, that this might be goodbye, that sometimes bad things happen to good people for no reason at all. She called her mother first. Called Ruth in the middle of the night because she couldn't wait until morning, couldn't carry this knowledge alone for another second. Ruth answered on the first ring because mothers always know, somehow, when their children need them. Mom, Sarah said, and Ruth heard everything in that one word. Heard the fear and the grief and the desperate plea for someone to tell her this wasn't happening, this wasn't real, there had been some mistake. What's wrong, baby? Ruth asked, already getting out of bed, already moving even though she didn't know where she needed to go yet. And Sarah told her. About the collapse and the hospital and the tumor and the surgery and the 60% and all of it, all the terrible information tumbling out in a rush of words that didn't quite make sense but made perfect, horrible sense. Ruth listened. And then she did what she'd always done when life got hard. She prayed. Right there on the phone, she started praying, her voice strong and certain even though her hands were shaking and tears were streaming down her face. Lord, we need you, she said. We need you right now. We need a miracle, God. We need your healing hand on my baby. We need you to guide those doctors. We need you to be present in that operating room. We need you, Jesus. We need you. And in Atlanta, Sarah closed her eyes and let her mother's prayers wash over her. Let them carry some of the weight that was crushing her. Let them remind her that she wasn't alone in this, that there was someone bigger than the tumor and the doctors and the statistics. After they hung up, Ruth went to Mary's room. Mary was already awake, sitting up in bed, clutching her grandfather's Bible. Grandma, she said. Is Mama okay? And Ruth realized not for the first time that this child knew things. Felt things. Had inherited her grandfather's gift of discernment, his ability to sense when something was wrong even when nobody had told him. So Ruth sat on the bed and pulled Mary into her arms and told her the truth. Because Mary deserved the truth. Because children are stronger than we give them credit for. Because lies, even kind ones, don't protect anyone in the end. She told her about the tumor and the surgery and what it all meant. She used simple words but didn't talk down to Mary, didn't sugarcoat reality beyond what was appropriate for an 8-year-old to process. And Mary listened with those serious eyes and that calm that seemed impossible for a child. And when Ruth finished, when she'd said everything there was to say, Mary asked one question. Can we pray for Mama? So they did. They kneeled beside the bed, hands clasped together, and they prayed. Ruth prayed with the practiced cadence of someone who'd been talking to God for 67 years. Mary prayed with the simple, direct faith of someone who believed absolutely that God was listening, that prayer mattered, that words spoken in faith could change reality. They prayed for hours that night. Until the sun came up. Until Mary's knees ached and her voice was hoarse. They prayed for Sarah's healing, for the doctor's skill, for peace that passes understanding, for miracles and mercy and the strength to face whatever came next. And somewhere in the middle of all that praying, Mary felt something shift. Not in the room. Inside her. A stirring, a knowing, a sense that God was speaking, not in words but in impressions, in feelings, in the kind of internal certainty that can't be explained or rationalized. She knew in that moment that her mother was going to be okay. Not because the odds were good or because the doctors were skilled or because she was trying to think positive thoughts, but because God had told her. Had given her that deep, unshakable assurance that whatever happened, whatever the surgery looked like, Sarah was going to survive. Mary didn't tell her grandmother this. She was only 8 and even she knew how crazy it would sound. How do you explain to someone that you just know something, that God just told you something, without sounding delusional or childish or like you're making things up? So she kept it to herself. Held it close. Let it be her secret, her promise from God, her reason to hope when hope seemed foolish. That was 3 days ago. And now they're sitting in Newark International Airport, waiting to board a flight that will take them to Atlanta, to the hospital, to Sarah's bedside before she goes into surgery tomorrow morning. Ruth watches her granddaughter and feels her heart breaking all over again. Because this child shouldn't have to be this strong. She shouldn't have to understand words like malignant, and survival rates, and best-case scenario. She shouldn't have to know what the inside of a hospital room looks like or how to navigate conversations with doctors or what it means when adults get that particular look on their faces, that look that says they're trying to be brave for you but inside they're terrified. She should be worried about homework and playground drama and whether she's going to get the toy she wants for her birthday. She should be watching cartoons and playing with friends and being gloriously, blissfully ignorant of how fragile life is, how quickly everything you love can be taken away. But life doesn't care what should be. Life just is. Anne Mary Johnson, at 8 years old, already understands this in a way that most adults spend their whole lives trying to avoid. "Baby," Ruth says softly, putting her hand on Mary's shoulder. The terminal noise swirls around them, hundreds of conversations and announcements and footsteps creating a wall of sound that somehow makes this moment feel private, intimate, like they're in a bubble separated from everyone else. "You doing okay?" Mary looks up at her grandmother with those big brown eyes that have seen too much for 8 years, eyes that carry wisdom they shouldn't have to carry yet. "I'm praying, Grandma," she says simply, her voice quiet but certain. "For Mama. For the flight. For everyone." The matter-of-fact way she says it, like praying for everyone is just what you do, like interceding for strangers is as natural as breathing, makes Ruth's throat tight with emotion. Ruth feels tears prick her eyes, feels them well up and threaten to spill over. She blinks them back because she's trying to be strong, trying to be the adult here, trying to hold it together for both of them. "I know you are, sweetheart," she manages. "Grandpa would be so proud of you." Anne Mary's face lights up, just a little, just enough to show that mentioning her grandfather still brings her joy even 2 years after his death. "He's with me, Grandma," she says, and there's no doubt in her voice. None. Not even a trace of uncertainty. She says it the way you'd say the sky is blue or water is wet, like it's just a simple fact of reality. "I can feel him. He's helping me pray." Anne Ruth Johnson, who has been a Christian for 67 years, who has sung in the church choir and taught Sunday school and read her Bible every single night before bed without fail, who has walked with God through poverty and racism and loss and every kind of hardship you can imagine, feels a chill run down her spine. Not a bad chill. Not fear or unease. But the kind of chill that comes from recognizing the presence of something holy, something beyond normal human experience. The kind of chill that reminds you that faith isn't just a comfort or a nice idea, but something real, something powerful, something that can reach across the barrier between life and death and connect generations through invisible threads of love and prayer. Because she hears it in her granddaughter's voice. That same certainty she used to hear in her father's voice, Thomas Johnson's voice, when he knew something, really knew something, in that way that couldn't be explained or rationalized or dismissed as coincidence. Thomas had that gift. The gift of discernment, some people called it. The ability to sense spiritual realities that others missed. To feel impressions from God, warnings and promptings and knowledge that came from somewhere beyond logic or reason. Ruth remembers the night before her father died. He had called her, which was unusual because he didn't like phones, preferred face-to-face conversations. But he called, and his voice had that quality, that certainty. "Baby girl," he said, "I need you to know something. I'm going home soon. Real soon. And I'm ready. I'm not scared. I've made my peace with God and with everyone I love. But I need you to promise me something." Ruth had tried to argue, tried to tell him he was being morbid, that he was fine, that he had years left. But he'd cut her off gently. "Don't," he said. "We both know what we know. Just listen. Promise me you'll teach little Mary everything I taught you. About faith. About prayer. About listening when God speaks. She's got the gift, Ruth. She's got it stronger than I ever did. And she's going to need it. So promise me." Ruth had promised, tears streaming down her face, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas died the next morning. Peacefully in his sleep, like he'd said he would. Like he'd known he would. And now, 2 years later, his granddaughter sits in an airport holding his Bible and talking about feeling his presence with the same unshakable certainty he'd had about his own death. Ruth squeezes Mary's hand. "I know he is, baby. I know he is." The gate agent's voice crackles over the intercom, pulling them both back to the present moment, back to the mundane reality of boarding procedures and seat assignments. "We are now beginning boarding for Flight 447 to Atlanta. We'd like to welcome our first-class passengers and those requiring assistance, as well as families traveling with small children. Please have your boarding passes ready." Ruth takes a deep breath. This is it. Time to go. Time to get on that plane and fly to Atlanta and face whatever comes next. She gathers their bags, her movements careful and deliberate. The carry-on with their clothes for a few days, packed hastily because who knows how long they'll need to stay, who knows what will happen. Her purse with all the important documents, insurance cards and identification and the phone numbers of Sarah's doctors. The small bag with snacks and water bottles and tissues and all the little things you need when traveling. Mary carefully places her grandfather's Bible in her backpack, making sure it's secure in the main compartment, making sure the little airplane pins don't scratch the worn leather cover. She runs her hand over the pins, touching each one like a talisman, like a reminder, like a promise. They stand in line with the other early boarders. There's a young woman with a baby in a carrier, the baby sleeping peacefully while the mother looks exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting many sleepless nights. An elderly man in a wheelchair being pushed by an airline employee, the man's hands shaking slightly, whether from age or Parkinson's or fear of flying, it's impossible to tell. A businessman who paid extra for priority boarding and is already on his phone, already irritated that the line isn't moving faster, his expensive suit and his annoyed expression marking him as someone used to things happening on his schedule. They shuffle forward slowly, the line moving in fits and starts, people fumbling with boarding passes and bags and the general awkwardness of trying to organize yourself while keeping the line moving. And as they walk down the jet bridge, as they get closer and closer to the plane that's going to change all of their lives in ways none of them can possibly imagine, as the familiar smell of jet fuel and recycled air grows stronger, Mary reaches out and takes her grandmother's hand. Her small hand slips into Ruth's larger one, and Ruth feels the warmth of it, the trust implicit in that simple gesture. This child who's been through so much, who's facing something no child should have to face, still reaches for her grandmother's hand, still trusts that together they can face whatever comes. "Grandma?" Mary says quietly, her voice almost lost in the sounds of rolling luggage and shuffling feet and the general murmur of travelers. "Yes, baby? I have a good feeling about this flight." Mary looks up at her grandmother, and there's something in her eyes, something peaceful and certain and almost otherworldly. "I think God's going to do something big." Ruth feels her heart clench. She wants to believe her granddaughter. Wants to trust in that childlike faith. But she's also lived long enough to know that God's plans don't always look the way we want them to. That sometimes, something big, means something painful. That faith doesn't always protect you from suffering. But she doesn't say any of that. Instead, she squeezes Mary's hand and tries to smile through her worry. "I hope you're right, sweetheart." What Ruth doesn't know, what nobody knows yet, what can't possibly be known because it hasn't happened yet and logic says it can't be predicted, is that Mary is absolutely, completely, 100% right. God is about to do something big. Something that will make headlines around the world. Something that will challenge everything people think they know about faith and science, about children and adults, about who deserves to be heard and who deserves to be believed. Something that will save 212 lives. But it's not going to look anything like what anyone expects. It's not going to be comfortable or easy or wrapped up in a neat package with a bow on top. It's going to be messy and complicated and challenge everyone involved to examine their own prejudices, their own assumptions, their own beliefs about how God works in the world. It's going to force people to choose between what they think they know and what's actually true. And for some people, that choice is going to be harder than facing death itself. Now, let me introduce you to the crew of Flight 447. Because understanding what's about to happen, understanding the miracle and the tragedy and the prejudice and the redemption that's all about to collide at 35,000 feet like a storm nobody saw coming, you need to know these people. You need to understand their stories, their struggles, their wounds, their fears. You need to know what brought them to this plane on this day, what experiences shaped them into exactly who they are in this moment. Because this isn't just a story about a little girl who saved a plane. It's a story about broken people being forced to confront their brokenness. It's about walls being torn down and hearts being changed and the painful, beautiful process of becoming better than you were. So let's start in the cockpit, where two people sit surrounded by instruments and switches and the awesome responsibility of bringing 212 souls safely from Newark to Atlanta. Captain Marcus Webb is 52 years old. He's sitting in the left seat, the captain's seat, going through his pre-flight checklist with the practiced efficiency of someone who's done this literally thousands of times. Marcus has been flying commercial aircraft for 28 years. 28 years. That's over 10,000 flight hours. That's hundreds of thousands of passengers safely delivered to their destinations. That's 28 years of perfect safety records, of smooth landings and calm handling of emergencies, of being exactly the kind of pilot you want in the cockpit when you're hurtling through the air at 500 miles per hour in a metal tube. You've seen it all. Emergency landings when engines failed. Medical emergencies where passengers had heart attacks or strokes or went into labor at 35,000 feet. Drunk passengers who had to be restrained. Terrified flyers who needed calm reassurance. Rough weather that tossed the plane around like a toy. Every possible scenario that commercial aviation can throw at you. And through it all, Marcus Webb remained calm. Professional. Exactly the kind of steady, unflappable presence that makes passengers feel safe, that makes flight attendants trust their captain, that makes co-pilots want to learn from him. Marcus is a black man who grew up in Detroit in the 70s, back when being a black man in America meant navigating a world that was officially desegregated but still deeply, profoundly racist in 1,000 subtle and not-so-subtle ways. Back when people would literally laugh if you told them you wanted to be a pilot. Back when guidance counselors would look at bright, ambitious black kids and steer them away from careers like that, suggest something more realistic, something more appropriate, something that implicitly meant more suitable for someone like you. Back when flight schools and airlines and the entire aviation industry was so overwhelmingly white that seeing a black pilot was unusual enough to be remarked upon, unusual enough that passengers would sometimes ask to speak to the real captain, assuming that the black man in the uniform must be pretending or mistaken or somehow not actually qualified to fly the plane. But Marcus Webb's father had fought in Vietnam. Had flown helicopters in combat, dodging enemy fire and landing in hot zones to extract wounded soldiers. Had risked his life for a country that still treated him like a second-class citizen when he came home. And Marcus's father had come back from that war and told his son something important, something that shaped the entire course of Marcus's life. "Son," he said, "the sky doesn't care what color you are. Physics doesn't care. Aerodynamics doesn't care. Gravity doesn't discriminate. The only thing that matters up there is skill and courage and the willingness to trust in something bigger than yourself. You want to fly. You can fly. Don't let anyone tell you different." So Marcus became a pilot. Against all odds, against all the discouragement and discrimination, he pursued his dream with single-minded determination. He fought through the subtle racism of flight schools where instructors were just slightly less helpful to him than to white students, where he had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. He endured the 100 small humiliations that people who've never experienced them can't even imagine. The passengers who asked if he was really the pilot. The colleagues who made jokes about diversity hires. The airline executives who praised his natural athleticism, when they meant to compliment his flying skills, as if piloting a plane was somehow related to physical prowess rather than knowledge and training. And he made it. He not only made it, he excelled. He became one of the most respected captains in the entire airline. When young pilots asked to fly with him, when the airline needed someone for the most challenging routes or the most important flights, they turned to Marcus Webb. He proved everyone wrong. Proved that skill and dedication and passion matter more than the color of your skin. Proved that excellence speaks louder than prejudice. But here's the thing about Marcus Webb. Here's the crack in his armor, the wound that won't quite heal, the price he paid for all that success. 3 years ago his marriage fell apart. 24 years with his wife, Diane. 24 years of shared history and inside jokes and the comfortable intimacy that comes from really knowing someone. 24 years of building a life together, raising a daughter, creating a home. Gone. Not because of infidelity or abuse or any of the dramatic reasons marriages usually end. Not because they fought all the time or fell out of love or had some terrible betrayal that made reconciliation impossible. Just distance. Just the slow, grinding erosion that happens when you're gone more than you're home. When you miss your daughter's school plays because you're flying to San Francisco. When you miss anniversaries because you're stuck in a hotel in Chicago waiting out a mechanical delay. When you miss the 1,000 small moments that make up a life because you're somewhere else, doing your job, being excellent at your career while your family learns to live without you. When your wife wakes up one day and realizes she's been essentially single parenting for 2 decades. When she looks at you and sees not the man she married but a stranger who shows up occasionally between flights, who's present in body but absent in spirit, whose real life happens in cockpits and hotels and airports while his family exists in the background. The divorce was civil. Painfully, awkwardly, heartbreakingly civil. They didn't scream or throw things or have dramatic confrontations. They sat across from each other at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared thousands of meals and conversations and moments of connection, and they calmly, rationally discussed how to end their marriage. They split everything fairly. She kept the house. He took his retirement account. They divided their belongings with the kind of careful equity you see in business transactions, not in the ending of a love story. They spoke to each other politely like acquaintances, like people who once knew each other but don't anymore. They did everything right on paper. The divorce was uncontested. The paperwork was filed efficiently. The lawyers barely had to get involved. But Marcus Webb's daughter, Jasmine, she's 10 now and she barely speaks to him. She answers his calls with one-word responses. She spends his court-mandated weekends with him doing homework or watching TV, polite but distant, present in body but absent in spirit in a way that mirrors his own absence throughout her childhood. Because in her mind, in her 10-year-old understanding of the world, he chose the sky over her. He chose passengers he'd never meet again over his own family. He chose his career over being her dad. And maybe in some ways she's right. Maybe Marcus did make that choice, not consciously but through 1,000 small decisions that added up over time. Maybe he did prioritize professional excellence over personal presence. Maybe he did convince himself that providing for his family financially was the same as being there for them emotionally. So Captain Marcus Webb sits in that cockpit every day carrying a weight that has nothing to do with the aircraft. Carrying the knowledge that he's saved thousands of lives, that he's one of the best pilots in the industry, that he's achieved everything he set out to achieve professionally. But he couldn't save the one thing that mattered most. His own family. His daughter's trust. The marriage that was supposed to last forever. And sitting next to him in the right seat is First Officer Amy Chen. Amy is 34, which means she's young by pilot standards, especially for someone on track to make captain. She's sharp as a tack, brilliant even, with a mind that processes information rapidly and makes good decisions under pressure. She's been flying for 12 years, and in those 12 years she's established herself as exactly the kind of pilot airlines love. Professional. Unflappable under pressure. Great with passengers. Good at managing crew dynamics. Hit all her training benchmarks early. Never had a significant incident or violation. Perfect attendance record. Everything you could possibly want in a commercial pilot. She's on track to make captain herself within the next 2 years, maybe sooner. The airline has her in their development program for future leaders. Her flight reviews are consistently excellent. Passengers frequently submit compliments about her announcements and her handling of flights. Amy Chen is everything the airline looks for when they think about the future of commercial aviation. She's exactly the kind of success story they feature in recruiting materials and diversity campaigns. Except Amy Chen has a secret. For the past 6 months she's been having panic attacks. Not in the cockpit, thank God. Not yet. Not where it could endanger passengers or compromise safety or give the airline any reason to question her fitness to fly. But everywhere else. In her car before work, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turn white, trying to breathe through the crushing sensation in her chest. In her apartment at night, waking from fitful sleep with her heart racing and sweat soaking through her sheets. In the bathroom during layovers, locked in a stall, gripping the walls and trying to convince herself that she's not dying even though every cell in her body is screaming that something is terribly, catastrophically wrong. The first time it happened, Amy thought she was having a heart attack. The chest pain, the racing pulse, the inability to catch her breath, the sense of impending doom, all of it matched what she'd learned about cardiac events in her emergency medical training. She went to the ER. They ran tests. EKG, blood work, chest x-ray, the full cardiac workup. Everything came back normal. Perfectly, frustratingly normal. Panic attack, the ER doctor said, with a kind of dismissive tone that suggested she was wasting his time with something trivial. High-stress job. It happens. Maybe talk to your doctor about anxiety medication. But Amy didn't talk to her doctor. Didn't seek treatment. Didn't tell anyone. Because if they find out, if there's any question about her mental fitness to fly, if there's any documentation of anxiety or panic disorder in her medical records, her career is over. Done. The FAA doesn't mess around with mental health issues in pilots. One diagnosis, one prescription for anxiety medication, one therapist's note suggesting she might not be fit for duty, and her medical certificate gets pulled. And without that medical certificate, she can't fly. All those years of training, all those hours in the air, all those dreams of making captain, gone in an instant. So Amy Chen does what so many people do. What society teaches us to do, especially in high-pressure careers where any sign of weakness can be fatal. She suffers in silence. She white-knuckles through every day, using every ounce of willpower to maintain that perfect professional facade. She checks and rechecks instruments, looking for problems that might trigger her anxiety. She obsesses over weather reports, studying forecasts and radar patterns and anything that might give her advance warning of turbulence or challenging conditions. She reviews maintenance logs compulsively, reading every write-up and every repair, looking for any hint that something might be mechanically wrong with the aircraft. She's become hypervigilant, her anxiety convincing her that if she just stays alert enough, if she just controls enough variables, if she just maintains perfect awareness of every possible risk factor, she can prevent the disaster her mind keeps insisting is coming. But hypervigilance is exhausting. Constantly being on guard, constantly scanning for threats, constantly preparing for worst-case scenarios, it wears you down. It makes every flight feel like a battle, every takeoff feel like tempting fate, every landing feel like a lucky escape rather than a routine procedure. And today, this flight, she's already checked the weather 3 times before even arriving at the airport. She's already reviewed the maintenance logs twice, even though she knows them by heart, even though nothing has changed since yesterday. She's already done everything she can to quiet the voice in her head that whispers relentlessly, "Something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong." But the voice doesn't stop. It never stops. Because that's the thing about anxiety, the thing that people who don't have it can never quite understand. It's not logical. It's not based on actual risk assessment. It's a malfunction in your brain's threat detection system, seeing danger everywhere, unable to distinguish between real risks and imagined ones. So Amy sits in that right seat, running through checklists and trying to maintain the calm, professional demeanor that everyone expects from her, while inside she's fighting a battle that no one can see. But let's move to the cabin crew. Because this is where things get really complicated. This is where prejudice and pain and unresolved trauma are about to crash into an 8-year-old girl's faith in a way that will force everyone involved to face truths they've been avoiding. Lead flight attendant Janet Whitmore is 41 years old. She's been with the airline for 15 years. 15 years of showing up on time, of following every protocol to the letter, of going above and beyond what's required. 15 years of perfect performance reviews, or nearly perfect anyway. 15 years of treating every flight like it was the most important one of her career, of maintaining professional standards even when passengers were rude or demanding or drunk. And 3 months ago she was passed over for a promotion. A promotion to cabin crew supervisor that she had earned, that she deserved, that everyone said was basically hers already. A promotion she'd been working toward for years, that represented not just more money but recognition, validation, proof that her dedication and her perfectionism and her unwavering commitment to doing things right actually mattered. The position went to someone else. Someone with less experience, less seniority, less dedication. Someone who was, in Janet's view, less qualified in every measurable way. It went to Marcus Webb's recommendation. A younger flight attendant named Sarah Chen, who Marcus had personally vouched for, who he said showed exceptional interpersonal skills and emotional intelligence. Those words, emotional intelligence, they burned Janet when she read them in the rejection email. Because what they really meant was that she, Janet Whitmore, wasn't warm enough. Wasn't personable enough. Too rigid, too by the book, too focused on protocols and procedures instead of making passengers feel welcome and valued. And maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe Janet did let her perfectionism overshadow her humanity somewhere along the way. Maybe she did start seeing passengers as potential problems to manage instead of people to care for, as variables to control instead of human beings with their own stories and struggles. But here's what the airline didn't see. Here's what they didn't consider, what they couldn't possibly know because Janet never talked about it, never let it show, never gave anyone a glimpse behind the carefully constructed professional facade she'd spent decades building. Janet Whitmore grew up poor. White, yes, but poor in a way that erases a lot of privilege real quick. The kind of poor where dinner sometimes meant bread and butter because there wasn't money for anything else. The kind of poor where the heat got shut off in winter and you slept in your coat. The kind of poor that made you acutely, painfully aware that you were different from other kids, that you didn't belong, that no matter how hard you tried you'd never quite measure up. Her father was an alcoholic who couldn't hold a job for more than a few months before his drinking got him fired. He'd come home reeking of whiskey, mean and unpredictable, sometimes crying about how sorry he was, sometimes raging about how nothing was ever his fault, how the world was against him, how if people would just give him a chance he could be somebody. Her mother worked 3 jobs just to keep them in a trailer that leaked when it rained, that got so cold in winter you could see your breath inside, that was so small that Janet shared a room with her 2 sisters and privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Janet wore the same pair of shoes until they literally fell apart, the soles flapping loose and water soaking through the holes. She wore hand-me-down clothes that never quite fit. She brought peanut butter sandwiches to school every day while other kids had packed lunches from the deli or money to buy hot meals. And she learned, early and brutally, that the only way out of that life was through rigid self-discipline. Through following rules, meeting standards, never giving anyone a reason to dismiss her or overlook her or decide she wasn't good enough. She studied when she was exhausted. She worked when she wanted to play. She saved every penny she earned from babysitting and odd jobs, hiding it in a coffee can under her bed because leaving it anywhere else meant her father might find it and drink it away. She got good grades not because she was naturally brilliant but because she worked twice as hard as everyone else. She got into college not because she had connections or money but because she refused to accept any other outcome, because she filled out dozens of scholarship applications and wrote essays until her hands cramped and her eyes burned. And the only way she made it out, the only way she escaped that trailer and that life and the suffocating poverty that crushed her family, was through never allowing herself flexibility, never cutting herself slack, never deviating from the plan. Because warmth and spontaneity and emotional intelligence were luxuries she never learned to afford. In her world, mistakes meant going hungry. Letting your guard down meant getting hurt. Trusting people meant getting disappointed. So yes, she's strict. Yes, she's sometimes cold. Yes, she follows protocols to the letter even when other flight attendants are more relaxed. Because that rigidity, that perfectionism, that absolute unwillingness to bend rules or make exceptions, that's what saved her. That's what got her out of poverty and into a career and into a life that doesn't involve wondering if the heat will be on or if there will be food in the refrigerator. And now, 3 months after being passed over for that promotion, after being told essentially that who she is isn't good enough, that the survival mechanisms that got her here are actually liabilities, Janet Whitmore is angry, bitter, resentful, looking for someone to blame, something to control, some way to prove that she's still valuable, still necessary, still deserving of respect even if corporate doesn't think she's warm enough or emotionally intelligent enough. She doesn't realize it yet, hasn't admitted it to herself. But she's about to take all that anger and bitterness and fear and disappointment and pain, all the accumulated hurt of 15 years of perfect service not being enough, of a lifetime of working twice as hard for half the recognition, and she's going to direct it at the least deserving target imaginable. An 8-year-old girl who just wants to pray for her dying mother. A little black girl with colorful beads in her hair and a Bible in her hands and faith that Janet lost somewhere along the way, if she ever had it at all. But not everyone on this crew has forgotten their humanity. Not everyone has let pain harden them into something brittle and cruel. Carlos Martinez is 29 years old, and he's been a flight attendant for 5 years. But this isn't his dream job. This isn't where he plans to end up. This is a means to an end, a way to pay bills while he pursues what he really wants. Carlos is in nursing school. He works these flights to pay tuition, to cover rent, to support himself while he pursues what he really wants to do with his life: help people heal. He's 2 semesters away from his nursing degree. 2 semesters from being able to work in a hospital, to do work that feels meaningful and important, to use his natural empathy and compassion in ways that actually matter. He chose nursing after his younger sister survived leukemia. After watching her go through 2 years of chemotherapy, watching her lose her hair and her energy and sometimes her hope. After watching nurses care for her with a compassion and dedication that kept his entire family from falling apart during the worst years of their lives. He remembers one nurse in particular, a woman named Patricia who worked the night shift. His sister would wake up at 2 a.m. terrified and nauseous and feeling like death, and Patricia would be there. Not just doing her job, not just administering medication and checking vitals, but really being there. She'd hold his sister's hand. She'd tell stories to distract her from the nausea. She'd braid her hair, the little that remained, with gentle fingers. She'd sneak in extra pudding cups because those were one of the few things his sister could keep down. She'd call her Mija, and mean it, treating this scared 13-year-old like she was her own daughter. Patricia probably doesn't remember them. She probably took care of hundreds of patients over her career. But Carlos will never forget her. Will never forget the difference one person made by choosing to see the human being in front of her instead of just the patient, the case number, the medical problem to solve. So Carlos is warm where Janet is cold. Empathetic where she's rigid. He sees passengers as people with stories and struggles and reasons for being on this plane, not just seat numbers to manage or potential problems to mitigate. When he sees Mary Johnson board the plane today, when he sees this little black girl with her colorful beads and her too big backpack and her worn Bible clutched to her chest like it's the most precious thing in the world, something in him immediately softens. He sees a child who's scared but trying to be brave. He sees a grandmother carrying weight that's written in every line of her face. He sees people who need kindness, who need to feel safe, who need someone to treat them like they matter. So he kneels down to Mary's level instead of looming over her. He compliments her beads and her pins. He makes her smile just for a moment. He treats her with the dignity and warmth that every human being deserves but doesn't always receive. He doesn't know yet that this simple act of human kindness, this basic decency that should be normal but increasingly isn't, is going to put him in direct conflict with his supervisor. He doesn't know that he's going to have to choose between keeping his job and doing what's right, between following orders and following his conscience. But he will. That moment is coming. And the choice he makes is going to matter more than he can possibly imagine right now as he helps Mary and Ruth find their seats and stow their bags. And then there's Diane Foster. Diane is 38, black, professional, and deeply, quietly religious in a way that doesn't announce itself but permeates everything she does. She wears a small gold cross around her neck, delicate and simple, not flashy or showy, just a quiet reminder of her faith that she touches sometimes without thinking, her fingers finding the familiar shape during stressful moments. She's been a flight attendant for 12 years and she's good at it. Genuinely good, not in the way that Janet is good, where good means following every rule and meeting every standard, but good in the way that matters to passengers. The kind of good that comes from actually caring about people instead of just following procedures. The kind of good that remembers names and notices when someone's anxious and goes out of her way to make sure everyone feels safe and valued. Diane grew up in a church where the Holy Spirit was real and present and expected. Not the kind of church where faith is polite and contained and expressed only in carefully controlled ways. The kind of church where people spoke in tongues and prophesied and laid hands on the sick expecting actual healing. Where miracles weren't ancient history but current events. Where God wasn't a distant concept but an immediate presence. Her grandmother had the gift of discernment. Could sense things about people, about situations, about spiritual realities that others missed. Could walk into a room and know immediately if something was wrong, if someone needed prayer, if danger was present even when everything seemed fine on the surface. And Diane inherited some of that. Not in as strong a form as her grandmother, but enough. Enough that she pays attention to her intuition. Enough that she trusts those quiet inner promptings that whisper pay attention, something's not right, listen carefully. Enough that when she sees Mary Johnson board the plane, when this little girl passes by clutching that Bible with a look of both peace and urgency in her eyes, Diane feels something. A stirring. A knowing. That familiar sensation of spiritual awareness, of the Holy Spirit drawing her attention to something important, someone important. She doesn't know what it means yet. Doesn't know why this particular child among all the children who board flights is different. But she's paying attention. She's listening. She's open to however God might choose to move on this flight. Which is more than you can say for most of the passengers boarding Flight 447, who are too absorbed in their own concerns to notice an 8-year-old girl with colorful beads and a Bible that's bigger than her hands. If you're loving this story so far and want to see what happens when Mary's faith collides with Janet's prejudice and how an 8-year-old's prayers end up saving everyone on this plane, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what's coming next is going to challenge everything you think you know about courage, conviction, and the power of listening when God speaks through the most unlikely voices. Let me introduce you to some of the passengers now. Because they're not just background characters or nameless faces filling seats. They're human beings with their own stories, their own struggles, their own reasons for being on Flight 447 today. And every single one of them is about to have their assumptions challenged in ways they can't possibly anticipate. Seat 12A, first class by the window, Richard Ashford. Richard is 55 years old and worth approximately $47 million, though he'll tell you it's closer to 50 if you count assets that are harder to liquidate. He made his fortune in hedge funds, playing with other people's money in ways that would make your head spin if you actually understood what he does, which most people don't, which is exactly how Richard likes it. The complexity, the obscurity of his work, it insulates him from criticism. It's hard to question someone's ethics when you can't even understand what they're doing. It's hard to object to how someone makes money when the mechanisms are so Byzantine that explaining them requires a graduate degree in finance. He's wearing a suit that costs more than most people make in a month. Bespoke, tailored perfectly to his frame, Italian fabric that feels like silk but wears like iron. His shoes are handmade in England, leather so soft you could sleep on it. His watch is a Rolex, not because he needs to tell time but because he needs people to know that he's the kind of person who wears a Rolex. He's on his phone before he even sits down, barking orders at someone about a deal that absolutely has to close today. His voice carries that particular tone of barely controlled aggression that powerful men use when they want everyone around them to know they're important, they're busy, they're dealing with things that matter more than whatever trivial concerns the little people have. I don't care what their lawyer said, Richard snaps into his phone, oblivious to or uncaring about the other passengers trying to settle into their seats around him. We had an agreement. They're trying to renegotiate at the last minute and I'm not having it. Tell them the deal closes by end of business today or we walk. No, I don't care if that makes them uncomfortable. They should have thought about that before trying to play games with me. He ends the call without saying goodbye, already pulling up his email to fire off messages to other people who exist primarily to do his bidding. Richard Ashford is used to getting what he wants. Used to people jumping when he speaks. Used to a world that rearranges itself around his convenience and his comfort. If he wants a better seat, the airline finds one. If he wants an earlier flight, they make it happen. If he's unhappy about something, someone gets in trouble. That's how his world works. Money and power and the willingness to make people's lives difficult until they give him what he wants. He's also, though he'd never admit it, though he'd probably fire anyone who dared suggest it, deeply insecure. Because all that money, all that success, all those deals and transactions and zeros in his bank account, they came at a cost that he's starting to realize might have been too high. His first marriage ended in a bitter divorce 15 years ago. His ex-wife Jennifer had finally had enough of being married to a man who loved money more than he loved her. The divorce was nasty, expensive, vindictive on both sides. She got the house in Connecticut. He got to keep his pride or what was left of it. His kids from that marriage, 2 sons who are now in their 20s, barely speak to him. They call on Christmas and his birthday, stiff obligatory conversations that last maybe 10 minutes before everyone's relieved to hang up. They're polite but distant, treating him like a stranger they're related to by accident rather than choice. Because Richard was never really a father to them. He was a presence in their house occasionally, a source of money, a name on their birth certificates. But he wasn't at their baseball games or school plays. He didn't help with homework or teach them to ride bikes. He was busy. Always busy. Making money, closing deals, building an empire that his sons couldn't care less about because they learned early that empires are cold places to grow up. His second marriage to Monica is better, mostly because she's learned not to expect much. She's learned that Richard will never be fully present, will never prioritize her over his work, will never change into the kind of husband she probably wanted when she said yes to his proposal. So she's made peace with it. Or at least she's made accommodation with it. She has her life, her friends, her charity work that keeps her busy. He has his deals and his money and his relentless pursuit of more even though he already has more than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. Their marriage is a transaction really. She gets financial security and social status. He gets arm candy and someone to come home to so he doesn't have to face his empty life alone. And sitting next to him in 12B is Monica Ashford, his second wife. Monica is 48, blonde in the way that requires monthly salon visits and quarterly touch-ups. Beautiful in a carefully maintained way that takes hours of daily effort and thousands of dollars monthly. Designer clothes, perfect makeup that looks natural but requires a dozen products to achieve, the kind of polished appearance that's supposed to look effortless but is actually a full-time job. She's terrified of flying. Absolutely, completely, irrationally terrified in a way that makes every trip an ordeal, every takeoff a near-death experience in her mind, every moment of turbulence a confirmation that this is it, this is when the plane finally falls out of the sky. She takes anxiety medication before every flight, Xanax that her doctor prescribed specifically for this purpose. She's already taken one this morning, washed it down with champagne from the first-class lounge, trying to get ahead of the panic that she knows is coming. She clutches the armrests during takeoff like they're the only things keeping the plane in the air. She spends entire flights waiting for something to go wrong, for the engines to fail or the wings to snap off or the pilot to have a heart attack or any of the 1,000 catastrophes her anxious mind conjures. Richard finds this annoying. Another example of how Monica isn't quite what he wanted, isn't quite strong enough or capable enough to be the kind of wife a man of his stature deserves. He's told her countless times to just get over it, as if fear was something you could dismiss with willpower and contempt. As if decades of trauma could be erased by telling someone to toughen up and stop being ridiculous. What Richard doesn't know, what Monica has never told him because she's learned that vulnerability is weakness in his eyes, is that her fear isn't irrational. It has a source, a reason, a traumatic origin that made her brain associate flying with death in ways that logic can't overcome. When Monica was 12 years old, her father died in a small plane crash. He was a pilot, private planes only, flew for fun on weekends. Took Monica up sometimes, taught her about pitch and yaw and how to read instruments. Made her love the sky, love the freedom of being above the clouds, love the way the world looked small and manageable from up high. Until the day his engine failed over the Rockies and he didn't make it to the emergency landing spot. Until the day Monica's mother received a phone call from the FAA and collapsed in the kitchen, her face crumbling, her whole body shaking. Until the day 12-year-old Monica understood that people you love can just disappear, can just stop existing, can just be gone in the time it takes a plane to fall from the sky. She watched her mother receive that phone call. Watched her entire family's life collapse in the space of a single conversation. Watched her mother become a shell of who she'd been, watched her brothers struggle with grief and anger, watched their house fill up with casseroles from neighbors who didn't know what else to do. So yeah, Monica is afraid of flying. Her brain learned at 12 years old that planes kill people you love. And no amount of statistics about how safe commercial aviation is, no amount of rational argument, can override that deep, primal fear imprinted on her developing brain at exactly the wrong moment. Richard doesn't know any of this. Has never asked. Doesn't care enough about Monica's interior life to be curious about where her fear comes from. He just knows it annoys him. Just knows he wishes she'd be stronger, braver, more like the women he sees in his business world who don't let emotion interfere with function. A few rows back in seat 14C sits Trevor Kim. Trevor is 26, Korean-American, brilliant in the way that tech industry people often are, able to see patterns in code that other people miss, able to solve problems that would stump programmers twice his age. He's a software engineer for a tech startup called Mindstream that's working on AI-powered personal assistants. Think Siri or Alexa, but actually useful, actually able to anticipate needs and solve problems without constant hand-holding. The company is about to either make him very rich or leave him unemployed, and which one happens depends entirely on tomorrow's investor meeting in Atlanta. They're pitching to a venture capital firm that could either fund their next 3 years of development or pass them by for the next shiny thing. Trevor's been working 80-hour weeks for 3 months preparing for this presentation, perfecting the demo, anticipating every possible question or objection. Everything he's worked for over the past 3 years, since dropping out of grad school to join this startup, since betting his future on founders he believed in and technology he thought could change everything, it all comes down to the next 48 hours. He's flying to Atlanta for the final prep session tonight and the pitch meeting tomorrow morning. The pressure is enormous. The stakes are literally his entire career. Trevor lives in his headphones. Noise-canceling, expensive Bose, blocking out the world so he can focus on his code, his problems, his carefully constructed digital reality where everything makes sense and follows logical rules. He's brilliant with computers. Terrible with people. Not because he's mean or unkind or deliberately antisocial. Just because he's never quite learned how to connect with others, how to read social cues, how to be present in the messy, illogical, emotionally complex world of human relationships. He grew up as the smart kid, the one who was always ahead in math and science, who was reading college textbooks in middle school, who understood computers better than he understood people. His parents, both engineers themselves, encouraged this, praised his intelligence, pushed him toward academic achievement. But they never quite taught him how to make friends, how to navigate conflict, how to deal with emotions, his own or anyone else's. So Trevor learned to retreat into code, into problems with clear solutions, into a world where if something doesn't work you can just debug it and fix it and everything makes sense again. Today, sitting on flight 447, he's already got his laptop out, already plugged into his noise-canceling headphones, already absorbed in reviewing code for tomorrow's demo. He's looking up from his screen long enough to notice what's happening in the actual, messy, complicated world around him. He doesn't see Mary and Ruth struggling with their bags. Doesn't notice Carlos helping them. Doesn't register any of the human dramas playing out around him. He's just code and headphones and the quiet anxiety of someone whose entire future depends on things going right tomorrow. Today that's going to change. Today, Trevor Kim is going to learn that some problems can't be solved with code, that some situations require human connection and presence and the willingness to look up from your screen long enough to notice what's actually happening. But he doesn't know that yet. Seat 16A across the aisle and a few rows back, James Peterson. James is 62, retired military, 25 years in the Army. He's got the bearing that never quite leaves soldiers even decades after they leave service. Straight posture, alert eyes, the ability to pack efficiently and follow procedures without complaint. He's traveling to his daughter's wedding in Atlanta, and he's nervous in a way that has absolutely nothing to do with flying, which he's done hundreds of times in military transports and commercial planes and helicopters and everything in between. He's nervous because James wasn't a great father. Wasn't even really a good father, if he's being honest with himself, which he's trying to be now that it might be too late to matter. He was deployed more than he was home. Iraq, Afghanistan, Germany, Korea, a dozen other posts over 25 years. He missed his daughter Emily's childhood in all the ways that matter. Missed first steps and first words. Missed school plays and soccer games. Missed parent-teacher conferences and birthday parties. Missed the 1,000 small moments that add up to knowing your child, really knowing them. When he was home he was distant. Authoritative. More comfortable giving orders than expressing love. He treated his family like another unit to manage, another mission to complete. He provided for them financially, made sure they had housing and healthcare and all the material things they needed. But he never quite learned how to be emotionally present. Never learned how to say, "I love you" without it sounding awkward and forced. Never learned how to hug his daughter without it feeling stiff and uncomfortable. So Emily grew up with a father-shaped hole in her life. She had a father's name on her birth certificate and in her house and at the dinner table when he was home. But she didn't have a dad, not really. Not in the way that matters to a little girl who just wants her father to show up to her ballet recital or tell her she's beautiful or make her feel like she's the most important thing in his world. James knows this now. Has known it for years, really, but never quite admitted it to himself until Emily got engaged and started planning her wedding and had to decide whether to even invite him. She did invite him. Asked him to walk her down the aisle. And James is terrified he's going to mess it up somehow, say the wrong thing, be too much of himself or not enough of the father she deserves. He's a man who led soldiers into combat without flinching, who made life and death decisions under fire, who earned medals for valor and leadership. But he doesn't know how to tell his daughter he loves her. Doesn't know how to apologize for all the years of absence. Doesn't know how to be what she needs in this moment. So he sits in 16A, spine straight, jaw clenched, trying to figure out what he's going to say when he sees Emily tomorrow, how he's going to make up for decades of emotional distance in the few days before she gets married and starts her own family and moves on with her life. And in seat 18F, near the back of the plane, sits Nina Rodriguez. Nina is 23, a college student at Georgia State University, flying home to Atlanta for spring break. She's a junior, studying social work, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working 20 hours a week at a community center. This is her first time on a plane. Ever. Not because her family couldn't afford it, though money was tight for most of her life. Not because she was afraid of flying or disliked travel. But because for 20 years she couldn't. Nina was brought to the United States from Mexico when she was 3 years old. Her parents, desperate to escape poverty and violence, desperate to give their children a better life, made the dangerous journey across the border. They settled in Atlanta, where her father found work in construction and her mother cleaned houses. They lived in a small apartment in a neighborhood where Spanish was spoken more than English. They built a life, but it was always precarious, always shadowed by the fear of deportation. For 20 years Nina couldn't travel. Couldn't risk getting on a plane and potentially being detained at the airport. Couldn't risk drawing attention to her undocumented status. Couldn't do the normal things that American kids did, like spring break trips or flying to visit relatives or study abroad programs. She lived her life carefully, quietly, always aware that one wrong move could mean her family being torn apart, could mean being sent back to a country she barely remembered, a place that stopped being home when she was too young to have real memories of it. But last year, finally, after years of paperwork and lawyers and waiting and hoping, Nina got her citizenship. She stood in a courthouse in Atlanta and took the oath, her hand over her heart, tears streaming down her face, surrounded by other people who understood what it meant to finally, officially, legally belong. And this flight, this simple, ordinary trip that most people take for granted, represents everything to her. Freedom. Safety. The ability to move through the world without fear. The right to travel like any other American, to show her passport at the gate and board a plane and not worry that this might be the moment everything falls apart. She's nervous about flying, but it's a happy nervousness. An excited nervousness. She keeps looking out the window even though they haven't taken off yet, can't quite believe she's really doing this, really sitting on a plane like it's the most normal thing in the world. Nina is also deeply religious. Catholic in the way that many Mexican families are, where faith is woven into daily life, where you cross yourself when you pass a church and say, Si Dios quiere, when making plans and keep a statue of La Virgen de Guadalupe in your home. She has a rosary in her pocket, worn smooth from years of prayers. She touches it now, her fingers finding the familiar beads, whispering a quick prayer of thanksgiving and protection. She's grateful. So grateful. For this opportunity, for this blessing, for this chance to finally live without looking over her shoulder. All of these people. All of these stories. All of these complicated, flawed, beautifully human beings with their fears and dreams and regrets and hopes are about to board Flight 447. Richard with his money and his bitterness. Monica with her fear and her trauma. Trevor with his code and his isolation. James with his regret and his desperate hope for redemption. Nina with her joy and her hard-won freedom. And in the back of the boarding line, holding her grandmother's hand, is Mary Johnson. 8 years old. Scared for her mother. Strong in her faith. Carrying a Bible that's seen more prayers than most churches. Completely unaware that in less than 2 hours, every single person on this plane is going to owe her their life. That her faith, the faith that's about to make her a target, is going to be the only thing standing between 212 people and death. But first they have to board. They have to settle into their seats and go through the familiar rituals of air travel. They have to become passengers, statistics, seat numbers. Before they can become witnesses to a miracle, they first have to become people willing to dismiss one. And that transformation, that journey from skepticism to belief, is about to begin. The boarding is routine. Practiced. The kind of choreographed chaos that happens 1,000 times a day at airports across the world. Flight attendants stand at the entrance, greeting passengers with those professional smiles that are required by company policy but don't quite reach their eyes, that speak of long days and difficult customers and the emotional labor of being constantly pleasant even when you're exhausted. Welcome aboard, they say over and over, checking boarding passes, directing people to their seats, answering the same questions they've answered 1,000 times before. People stuffing bags into overhead compartments, grunting with effort, rearranging other people's belongings to make their own fit, engaging in the subtle territorial battles that come with shared space and limited resources. Passengers jostling for armrests, silently claiming the territory that both people in the row think they're entitled to. The middle seat passenger hoping that the armrests are theirs by default since they got the worst seat. The window and aisle passengers thinking they deserve the armrests because at least the middle person doesn't have to climb over anyone. People settling into their seats with the resigned patience of those who've done this 100 times before, who know that the next few hours will be uncomfortable and boring but necessary, who've made peace with the indignities of modern air travel. Janet Whitmore is at the front of the plane, positioned near the first-class cabin, checking boarding passes with efficient precision. She's in her element here, in this world of clear procedures and defined roles, where everything has a place and everyone has a function. She greets first-class passengers with slightly warmer smiles, the kind of differential treatment that comes automatically when you work in an industry where some customers pay 10 times more than others for essentially the same service. She directs economy passengers to continue toward the back with a brisk efficiency that doesn't quite qualify as rude but certainly doesn't qualify as warm. Everything is in its place. Everything is under control. This is what Janet needs right now, this sense of order, this ability to manage a contained environment where she knows all the rules. Carlos is in the economy cabin, helping passengers with their bags, chatting warmly with anyone who makes eye contact, making people feel welcome in a way that comes naturally to him. He lifts a heavy suitcase into an overhead bin for an elderly woman who's clearly struggling, waves off her profuse thanks with a smile. He helps a young mother juggle a toddler and a diaper bag in a car seat, getting them settled with patience and genuine kindness. This is why Carlos became a flight attendant in the first place, back before he decided to go into nursing. Because he likes helping people. Likes making difficult situations slightly easier. Likes the feeling of making someone's day just a little bit better with small acts of kindness. Diane is checking the emergency equipment in the rear galley, but her eyes keep drifting to the passengers boarding, watching them settle in, observing with that quiet attention that's become second nature to her. She sees a businessman already on his phone before he's even sat down, hears him talking loudly about deals and money and things that sound important to him but probably aren't in the grand scheme of things. She sees a college-aged girl clutching her phone and taking pictures of everything with the excitement of someone for whom flying is still novel and special. She sees a retired couple holding hands as they shuffle down the aisle, still in love after what must be decades together, still treating each other with gentleness and care. And then she sees Mary and Ruth. They enter the plane and Diane feels that familiar stirring, that sense of spiritual awareness that she's learned to trust over the years. Her hand goes unconsciously to the cross around her neck, her fingers finding the familiar shape. There's something about this grandmother and granddaughter. Something in the way they carry themselves. The grandmother with her Sunday best and her dignity despite obvious worry. The little girl with her too big backpack and her serious eyes and that Bible clutched like a lifeline. Carlos sees them too, and his expression immediately softens in that way it does when he sees people who need extra care, extra kindness. He approaches them, kneeling down to get on Mary's level rather than looming over her the way adults so often do with children. "Well, hello there," Carlos says warmly, his voice carrying genuine delight. "Those are some beautiful beads in your hair. And wait, are those little airplane pins on your backpack?" Mary nods shyly, her natural reserve making her hesitate before speaking. But there's something about Carlos, something in his warm eyes and genuine smile, that makes her feel safe enough to respond. "I make them," she says quietly, her small voice almost lost in the ambient noise of boarding passengers. "Each one is a prayer for safe travels." Carlos feels something in his chest tighten. Not sadness exactly, but that bittersweet feeling you get when you encounter genuine innocence, pure faith, the kind of belief that the world hasn't yet managed to crush or complicate or turn cynical. "That's wonderful," he says, and he means it completely. "And you know what? I think those prayers are going to make this the safest flight I've ever worked." Mary smiles then, just a little, just enough to transform her serious face into something lighter, younger, more like what an 8-year-old should look like. "I hope so," she says. "We have to get to Atlanta. My mama needs me." And Carlos feels his heart break just a little bit, the way it does when you're reminded that the world is full of children carrying burdens they shouldn't have to carry, facing fears that should belong to adults. "Well, then we'll make sure you get there safe and sound," he promises, standing up and checking their boarding passes. "You're in 22D&E all the way in the back. Let me help you with those bags." Ruth is about to protest, about to say they can manage, because Ruth Johnson has been managing on her own for most of her life and accepting help doesn't come naturally. But Carlos is already taking her carry-on bag, already leading them down the aisle with a warmth that makes Ruth's throat tight with unexpected emotion. It's been so long since anyone treated her granddaughter with simple, uncomplicated kindness. So long since someone saw Mary as just a child who needed care rather than a problem to manage or a responsibility to discharge. They move through the plane, passing through first class where Richard Ashford is still on his phone, barely glancing up as they pass. Past business class where Trevor Kim is already plugged into his laptop, completely absorbed in his digital world. Past row 16 where James Peterson sits stiffly, looking out the window with the tense posture of someone trying not to think too hard about uncomfortable things. And finally they reach row 22, near the back of the plane, close to the rear galley where Diane is still going through her checklist. Carlos helps them stow their bags in the overhead compartment, making sure everything is secure, making sure Mary's backpack with its precious cargo of pins and Bible is within easy reach in the seat pocket. "You too comfortable?" he asks, genuine concern in his voice. "Need anything? Water, blanket, extra pillow?" "We're fine, thank you," Ruth says, and her voice carries so much gratitude for this small kindness that Carlos feels it in his chest, feels it settle somewhere deep inside where he keeps all the reasons he does this job, all the reminders of why helping people matters. "Well, I'm Carlos," he says, "and if you need anything at all during the flight, you just press that call button, okay?" He winks at Mary. "And I'll expect to hear all about those airplane pins when we land safely in Atlanta. Maybe you can tell me how you make them." Mary nods, her face lighting up just a little at the prospect of sharing something she loves with someone who seems genuinely interested. Carlos heads back up the aisle, and as he passes the galley, Janet stops him. "Don't get too attached," she says quietly, her voice carrying that particular tone of barely controlled irritation that's been her baseline for the past 3 months. "We have 200 passengers on this flight. They're not your personal friends." Carlos wants to respond, wants to say that maybe that's the problem, maybe treating passengers like friends instead of problems is exactly what the airline should value, maybe that's what emotional intelligence actually means. But he doesn't say any of that. Because he's learned over 5 years of working under Janet that arguing with her is pointless, that she's so wrapped up in her own pain and bitterness that she can't hear anything that challenges her worldview. So he just nods and moves on, because sometimes the most radical act is simply continuing to be kind even when kindness isn't valued, even when your supervisor thinks compassion is a weakness. What he doesn't see, what nobody sees except Diane who's watching from the galley with troubled eyes, is Janet glancing back at row 22. At Mary and Ruth settling into their seats, the grandmother helping the granddaughter get comfortable, both of them already looking tired from the emotional weight they're carrying. And something in Janet's expression hardens. Maybe it's the way Ruth is dressed, Sunday best for a Thursday flight, the kind of putting on airs that Janet associates with people trying to be something they're not, people who don't understand that dressing up doesn't change who you are or where you come from. Maybe it's the little girl with all those beads and pins and that Bible, the kind of overt religious display that makes Janet uncomfortable because it reminds her of things she's tried to forget. Reminds her of the church her mother dragged her to as a child, where they promised that faith would provide but it never did, where they talked about God's love while her father drank away their grocery money and nobody did anything to help. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just that Janet is hurting and angry and looking for someone to take that hurt out on. Someone to control. Someone to remind that she, Janet Whitmore, is still in charge here, still matters, still has power even if corporate doesn't think she's good enough for promotion. Whatever the reason, in that moment, Janet Whitmore makes a decision. She's going to keep an eye on that little girl. And if she steps one toe out of line, if she causes even the slightest disruption, if she gives Janet even the smallest excuse, Janet is going to handle it. The rest of the passengers board in a steady stream. The overhead bins fill with bags and coats and all the things people insist they need for a 2-hour flight. The seats fill with bodies, with stories, with people who think this is just another ordinary day, just another routine flight, just another boring Thursday morning getting from Newark to Atlanta. The flight attendants move through their familiar routines. Janet doing her safety checks with rigid precision. Carlos helping passengers and making small talk and spreading warmth wherever he goes. Diane watching, observing, that spiritual awareness making her more attentive than usual. In the cockpit, Captain Marcus Webb and First Officer Amy Chen are going through their pre-flight checklist. The familiar back and forth of pilot and co-pilot confirming systems, checking instruments, making sure everything is as it should be before they take this plane and everyone on it into the sky. Fuel? Marcus asks. Full. Sufficient for flight time plus reserves? Amy responds, her eyes scanning the gauges. Hydraulics. Normal pressure, all systems green. Engine 1? All parameters normal. Engine 2. Amy pauses just for a second looking at the readouts. Everything shows normal. Everything is within parameters. But that voice in her head, that anxiety that's been her constant companion for 6 months, it whispers that something could be wrong, something they're missing. All parameters normal, she says, pushing down the anxiety, refusing to let it show. They continue through the checklist, professional and thorough, 2 skilled pilots doing what they've done thousands of times before. The flight attendants do their safety demonstration. The one that everyone ignores, too busy with their phones and their books and their own thoughts to pay attention to information that could save their lives if something goes wrong. They demonstrate how to fasten a seatbelt, as if adults who've been buckling seatbelts in cars since childhood need this explained. They point out the emergency exits, which nobody bothers to locate because this is just a routine flight, nothing's going to happen. They explain the oxygen masks and the life vests, and passengers nod absently while scrolling through their phones. Captain Webb's voice comes over the intercom, smooth and professional, carrying the authority and calm that passengers need to hear from the person flying the plane. Good morning, folks, this is your captain speaking. On behalf of the entire crew, welcome aboard Flight 447 with service to Atlanta. We're currently number 3 for takeoff here at Newark, so we should be wheels up in just a few minutes. Once we're airborne, we'll be climbing to our cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. It's a beautiful day for flying, clear skies all the way to Atlanta, no weather concerns. Flight time today should be about 2 hours and 28 minutes, and we should have you on the ground in Atlanta right on schedule at 11:15 local time. Temperature there is a pleasant 68 degrees. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure. The engines roar to life, that familiar sound that some passengers find comforting and others find terrifying. The plane begins to move, backing away from the gate, beginning the slow taxi toward the runway. And in seat 22E, Mary Johnson closes her eyes and begins to pray.